Okay, on today's episode of Race Car and Chill, we are going to be doing a full front suspension on a BMW E28. This is going to be a year 1987. But we're going to start out first by putting the date on all of these parts that we're going to be replacing today. So in the future, when we have to do some maintenance, we'll know a little bit more about the car, on what's been replaced and how long things lasted too. Alright, first thing is first, we actually just sprayed everything down with degreaser and then pressure washed it off just so we're not getting super dirty doing this. But the first thing we're going to do after we take the wheel off and obviously get the car in the air, we're going to take the caliper off. You're going to have an ABS sensor here. We're going to disconnect the brake line as well, but we're going to take the caliper off first to give us more room to disconnect the line. We've replaced these lines before, as you can see, so you may have different luck taking off a brake line, but obviously when we take the brake line off, it's going to have a bunch of fluid coming out, so be ready for that. First bolt we're going to take off is a 19mm here, and there's another one that holds the caliper on the bottom as well, down here, another 19mm. Another thing we should note is the set screw on the rotor. This, it's a common misconception that this bolt or the screw actually holds the rotor on. It does not. It's just there to help you line it up when you're installing it. It should not be very tight, so if we installed things correctly, which these are brand new rotors that we had just installed them a really long time ago and haven't driven the car, this set screw should come right out.
You're probably going to have a really hard time with it though.
Yeah. Alright, so a little disclaimer before you guys get too into this and then start yelling at me for giving you guys the wrong sizes. These things do change with the years, especially if these parts have been replaced. But for our set screw on the rotor, that was a 5mm Allen head. And I did misspeak about that sensor we already unplugged earlier. One of them, this is the brake pad wear sensor. The ABS sensor is right here, and to get it out, as you can see, it's bolted in. It's got another 5mm Allen head on it, and the bolt has a little washer, so don't lose that. And it goes right through here, right in here. The Allen head comes out through here, and the sensor was really difficult to pull out. I actually couldn't do it by hand. I had to use a pry bar to pry the sensor out of this hole here. As you can see, this one's pretty gross. We're gonna clean that up before we put it back in. The lighting sucks here. But it's just a magnet, so you definitely want to have that really clean when you put it back in. Okay, the first thing we're going to do to get this whole spindle assembly out is going to be to disconnect the sway bar, which is going to be one 17mm nut right there, and then we'll be able to push the end link away from the actual knuckle. So most likely you're going to have the same issue we ran into right here on this end link nut. As I spin it, it spins inside of the ball joint because it's so worn. So because of that, I noticed that on the new ones, you see how there's a flat edge there? So you can actually hold it with a 17mm on this side, and then use a 17mm ratchet on this side to get the bolt off. I use a 3-inch extension, puts my ratchet right here in the perfect spot. Okay, so now we're laying under the car. The next step we're going to do is take off this 17mm right here, and then there's two 17mm right here as well that you can see. We're going to take all those off, and on this 19 we're going to take that off as well. There's a cotter pin. It might be difficult for you to see. There's a cotter pin we got to pull out before we can take this castle nut off. I should make a correction on this big castle nut that had a cotter pin going through it. It's 22mm. So we got all that disconnected, came up here, took these 312s off on the top of the strut assembly, and once we get all of these ball joints pulled out of the control arms, the knuckle should be ready to go. So it doesn't fall out on me. I'm gonna put just a few of these, just a few threads on there. So once we do release the knuckle, it's being held up by these nuts. So earlier when I told you guys that there's these two bolts here, there's actually a third one right up here, up against the heat shield that you need to take off as well for this little plate to come off. Okay, so we got the shock assembly out of the way. I just basically pried it through here and kind of wedged it out. Now we can finally get to this castle nut here. It's also got a cotter pin. Pull the cotter pin out, take that nut off, and then this assembly will come off and we can start taking all of the arms off now. Okay, so here's the plate once we got all of the ball joints off of them. They were pretty tight. We used one of these pullers here. There's a couple different kinds of pullers you can use. This is the one we chose. It worked pretty easy. Now that we've got all the control arms are separated, you can hear the noise they make and the play they have in them, which is why we're replacing them. It's going to be as simple as just pulling them off. So this one looks like it's going to be two 19s here. one on each side. They might be 17s, I'm just guessing at this point, but we're just gonna go through and take this bolt out, take out the bolts through here. It's gonna be a little difficult to get to. We may need to take this sway bar off as well to get to it. And then we're gonna take this off as well. So that's gonna be the 3 arms we're gonna replace today. And then we're gonna drop the sway bar as well to get to some stuff up there. I'll show you in a second. All right, since we're replacing these arms on the steering arms here, let's go ahead and talk about it a little bit. Because anything we do here is gonna throw off our alignment, and anytime you do suspension work, you should be getting in alignment, but this is we want to at least get it close so we can drive it to get in alignment after this. All right, so on the passenger side, there's a little heat shield you got to take off here. It's got 2 10mm, are they 10s or 14s? 10s. 2 10mm nuts or bolts that you got to take off to get that heat shield off. And once you take that heat shield off, right under it, you can see that there is the bolt for the lower control arm. So the heat shield has to come off so you can get access to the head of that bolt. Okay, so I apologize about the poor lighting, but we're gonna take off this nut here that holds this arm, the steering arm here. So that's gonna be a 17 down there, and then it's got a bolt head. It's actually a bolt, so I'm gonna hold it with a wrench on this. Okay, there goes the nut. There's a washer. There's there a washer that can walk through. Yep. There's a washer on top of that as well. Something to keep in mind for reassembly. And then this should be able to get pushed up. All right, so we took that bolt out, and then here comes the whole steering linkage, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so we're replacing the whole assembly, and we basically took out the old one, and then we're gonna assemble the new one next to it on the ground before we put it in the car. And what you're looking for here is to get the alignment close enough to where the alignment shop can get it perfect. But we measured basically from the middle of the ball joint to the middle of the ball joint on the old arm, and it was perfectly 12 inches. So we try to kind of unloosen this and turn this whole thing out to make the length the same way. Trying to take off a little bit on each side instead of doing it all on one side. And hopefully the alignment shop will be able to get it perfect, but this will get it close enough. Okay, next we're gonna take off the sway bar. It's gonna be 2 13mm on each side. Actually, it is just one. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and start reassembling everything here. I've got both control arms here. Nothing is tightened down yet. Everything is hand tight except for this ball joint here. We cranked this down as tight as we could get it because we're about to put the shock on now, and we're not gonna have access to it after the shock is on. So, but everything else is loose here. They're all just hand tight. Once we assemble everything, we're gonna put a load on the suspension, and then we're gonna tighten everything down. That way the bushings last as long as they should. So next we're going to put the shock in. Okay, so you can see we've assembled everything now. We've even put the tires back on. But everything we assembled, we only hand tightened except for that one nut I showed you on top of it that goes right under the strut mount. Everything here is hand tight, and we jacked the car up. And we actually let it sitting on its own. We let it sit on its own weight. So now there's a load on the suspension, and now we're gonna go through and tighten everything down with a load on it, and then you'll be done.